Hello, my name is Marcella Pasternak, and together with my classmates Zora and Edward, we will analyze the article Cross-Temporal and Cross-National Poverty and Mortality Rates Among Developed Countries. Here we have some information about the article, which was published in 2013 in the Journal of Environmental and Public Health, written by 5 authors within the 7th Framework Program Growing Inequality Impacts. As we saw in our course, our research question is the question that the article project sets out to answer. In this case, the main questions are how cross-national variations in relative poverty rates are related to cross-national variations in survival possibilities in relatively rich countries. Considering the relation between relative poverty and mortality rates, has relative poverty prevented or delayed an even greater fall in mortality? Just to make it easier to understand, we use the same framework studied in class to understand the research question. The inequality criteria is the relative poverty rates that determines the disparity of mortality rates. The space and time frame are 26 countries from 1980 to 2005. I would like to explain relevant contextual information regarding this research. The authors say that a key issue is the relationship between poverty and ill health and premature death, shown by several previous investigations. In this sense, poverty affects mortality rates, and obviously in poorer countries, mortality rates are higher. So the authors wanted to explore how is the relationship in what they considers to be richer countries. The relationship between income and health indicators were shown by many studies, such as the Rogers studies, that indicates that countries with lower inequality have higher life expectancy. One of the important particularities of this research is how they address this relation between relative poverty and mortality rates with attention of welfare regimes. In other words, they want to study also the welfare systems and how the systems impact on mortality rates of each country, because as previous studies have shown, they have been very important to public health. Therefore, the ability of the programs to alleviate poverty has proved to be a key issue for variations in mortality rates across nations. The aim was to analyze the effect of relative poverty upon mortality rates among 3 age groups: infants, children, and the working age adults, also stratified by gender, using a low threshold of 40% of median in a time period of 1980 to 2005, with an imbalanced time series for 26 countries belonging to the rich world. As data sources, they used the Luxembourg Income Study and the Human Mortality Database as main sources to construct this age-related poverty rates across countries, merged with data on age and gender-specific mortality from the Human Mortality Database. As the main variables, they used mortality rates, assessed for 3 gender-specific classes: infants, children, and adults. They used poverty rates calculated using a standard income poverty headcount measurement. The control variable was the least wave number, used to all analysis to allow for time-related changes in poverty and mortality rates, and the GDP per capita, adjusted to changes in cost of living across time and space. As the analytical approach, they first inspected bivariate plots to observe the general pattern of the relationship between age-specific mortality rates and the background variables by looking at developmental pattern in mortality over cross-sections and welfare regimes. And thereafter, they proceeded to this multivariate analysis to observe how the bivariate relationships will change when other variables are included in the regression models.
Hi, my name is Edward, and I'll be going over and breaking down the key findings and results in the study. First, we'll start by looking at figures 2a and 2b. These show severity and variability of infant mortality rate focused on different welfare state regimes. Here we can observe the standardized mortality rate per 1,000 citizens among female and males in different welfare state regimes, 1 being Nordic, 2 Central European, 3 Liberal, 4 South European, 5 Post-Socialist, and 6 being Other. This information is also represented across waves, 1980 to 2005. There are some main takeaways. There is an overall downward trend across the countries in infant mortality that can be seen globally. Infant mortality rates among boys are higher than girls on average across countries and time points. But we can see that mortality rates are lowest in the Nordic group, and with very little variation between the 4 countries included in the cluster. Variation between years remained relatively low too, with a modest and absolute decline in infant mortality. Here we can see a pooled data study shown in Table 2. Results from this pooled cross-sectional time series analysis of 26 countries shows the greatest correlation being between infant mortality rates and GDP. The infant mortality rate is conditioned by the wealth and economic characteristics of the respective nation that factor into the GDP. However, GDP is not just an indicator of economic prosperity, but also represents a trend of modernization that includes access to better food, healthcare, sanitation, access to clean water, all of these factors being considered combative against infant mortality. Despite this, there are further considerations. The study shows that the decline in GDP during the severe economic crisis in Finland, Sweden, and Switzerland in the 1990s did not result in more infant mortality. This indicates that GDP, although largely instrumental, is not sufficient enough a condition to directly determine child mortality, showing that there are other factors that need to be considered. Additionally, the study reveals that the larger the share of GDP is made up of social spending, the lower the infant mortality rate is. This is the second greatest correlation in the study, being the mortality rate and social spending. Furthermore, in the merged data, there is a relatively low link between infant mortality and child poverty rates. While relative poverty is strongly correlated with mortality in the first and last waves, in waves 2 and 3 the correlations are weak. Here we can see the correlation between child mortality and GDP, social spending, and child poverty from 1980 through 2005. They found that a 1% increase in child poverty corresponded to about a 2% increase in infant mortality. Other notes of interest would be that the inclusion of social spending in the study leads to a decrease in poverty, close to 40%. According to the findings, introduction of GDP per capita does not change the results. In this instance, male and female results are overall very similar and can be discussed together. When introducing welfare regimes, poverty estimates stay around the same. Welfare regimes capture different welfare state characteristics and also different levels of economic prosperity. The coefficient for GDP totally disappears. When controlling for poverty, wave, GDP, social spending, and welfare regime, infant mortality rates are higher in Central European, liberal, and post-socialist regime types compared to the Nordic regimes. Southern European and other regimes do not differ as much from the Nordic region. Here we can see Figure 5, which shows the relation between age-standardized death rates among children and the three main explanatory factors. GDP plus social spending have stronger association with child mortality, while association between relative child poverty and mortality is more modest. Over time, there has been an increasingly strong negative association between GDP per capita and mortality, along with social spending. There are more fluctuations with poverty. The lower the social spending, the higher the mortality. The lower the GDP, the higher the mortality. While the advantage from higher welfare regimes greatly affects babies, Nordic countries' high welfare regimes equating to very low mortality rates, the difference becomes less pronounced in children. It is, however, worth noting that whereas in other aspects Nordic countries have the lowest mortality rates, in the adult test the Southern European model actually outcompetes the Nordics, with lower mortality rates.
Hi, my name is Zora, and I'm going to be talking to you about the conclusions, considerations, and interpretations that I've been sort of brainstorming from the study. So, first of all, with regard to methodological considerations, the first thing that is really important to bring attention to is that the panel structures in the study are unbalanced because the data sets that they use from each country are not from all of the countries at the exact same points in time. They come from different years, so basically this means that we're looking at different data sets in different waves. This has the potential to skew the accuracy of the results because, for example, there could have been some big global event in 1996 that influenced results in some countries in very specific ways. So if there's only data for those specific countries from that time, and then there's other data for another country from a different time with different global events happening, the results could be unbalanced. The other thing that the authors address is that they chose to analyze the results of their studies with a level model as opposed to a change model. So there's a chance that with level models you could be missing some unmeasured heterogeneity, but the authors defend their point in choosing the level model by saying that they assumed that it's the broad changes in poverty that are the most important over time versus yearly fluctuations, which would be what the change model was focusing on. Now, I also wanted to raise attention to the Nordic model. So the study focuses a lot on the Nordic model, and there's a lot of discussion today around whether or not the model as it was traditionally viewed is still alive today. So typically the Nordic model is associated with social corporatism, having a deep welfare state, which means having higher taxes, going towards things like education, healthcare, etc. A lot of, social spending. There's also, it's associated with a very high percentage of unions. So while all of this is still relatively very much alive, there's been a lot of questioning as to if the Nordic model hasn't weakened since the 90s. So before the 1990s, there was a very strong labor movement, but then during the 90s, the strong labor movement really disintegrated, and this was mostly due to globalization, because it was replaced with more intense neoliberal free market reforms. So this change has a name. It's the Social Democratic Compromise, which basically entailed the liberal democratic policies being more integrated with a sort of capitalist oriented economy. So even though overall in terms of the study, Nordic countries still have the highest levels of social spending, I think it's important to bear in mind that the growth of these neoliberal concepts and free marketization and decrease in unions, etc., during the time of all of these changes took place during the time of the study. I think that it's really important to bear this in mind when analyzing the results of the Nordic model. Now, I also wanted to get into how the study talks a lot and compares the Nordic model versus the Southern European model. So according to the study, the Nordic model outcompetes the Southern European model for child mortality, but then analyzing adult mortality, the Southern European model actually comes out ahead with less adult mortality. So this suggests that there could be other factors at play besides social spending and relative poverty that are affecting mortality rates. So one idea that I thought of was the blue zones, which are places in the world in which people have relatively long lifespans. 2 of the 5 blue zones are located in Greece and Italy, which are 2 southern European countries, and one hypothesis of why they live so long is their diet. So since the author suggested that there could be other factors contributing to a longer lifespan, I think it would be really interesting to compare the Mediterranean diet with the Nordic diet and see if this could be connected. So I think it's really important to understand the context, the historical background behind the nations included in the study during the time of the study, which is between 1980 and 2005. This time was ultimately the acceleration of globalization across the world. So one really important development was the formal creation of the European Union in 1993. This was almost exactly halfway through the study, so I think it's important to consider that the results of the study could have very well been affected by the economic adjustment of the countries joining the Union, especially since 19 out of 26 of the countries in the study are European. Now, the 1980s and 90s were really important for globalization. A lot of ideologies and policies like neoliberalism, free trade policies, and capitalist ideals were really becoming prominent. Leaders like Reagan and Thatcher were in power. There were other free trade zones like NAFTA and Mercosur starting. Then, of course, in Eastern Europe, there was the operation and then the fall of the communist regime and the transition into post-socialist regimes from Soviet rule. And the Balkan Wars and the fall of Yugoslavia. So even though the authors, I think, did a great job of controlling for as many factors as possible, I still believe that when we analyze things like relative poverty and changes in mortality rates, it's very, very important to take into consideration other factors at play in the political and social and economic climate.